Mega Man Zero didn't leave me with a strong first impression. It wasn't a bad game or anything, it was alright, had some fun bits, but for the most part, it was a thing that happened, got popular with other people, and I never really looked back. Even when I did procure a Game Boy Advance, and despite that period where GBA carts were really cheap and you had to deal with the possibility of fraudulent replications, I never bid on the Mega Man Zero series, so I never played those sequels until the various collections came out, including this Legacy collection that we'll be using for the rest of this run. So while Zero didn't wow me initially, it did wow other people, and naturally was enough of a success for Capcom to make a sequel, and that gave us Mega Man Zero 2, originally released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003. And the first thing I will say about the game, I like that in the intro level you still have the old pause menu from the previous game, showing some noticeable wear and tear as Zero has been fighting off Neo-Arcadian X drones for a year and is practically coming off at the seams. This also provides ample explanation as to why all your weapons are back to their basic power levels after building yourself up like a beast in the previous game. It's a nice nod of continuity that I actually appreciate, and when you make it to the new Resistance space, you're given a spiffy new pause menu that actually works, and has a bunch of new features. Anyway, a quick bit on control, which largely remains the same as before since a lot of the base Mega Man Zero gameplay has been retained and is relatively untouched, so you have the same control options as before. Zero can use either his Buster Shot or Z-Saber, both of which can be built up to become more chargeable and versatile. You also retain the Shield Boomerang from the previous game, which is useful for deflecting shots or can be charged to be used as a boomerang weapon. However, the Triple Rod weapon from the previous game has been replaced with a new Chain Rod, which is basically a cross between a bionic arm and a Castlevanian whip, in that you can latch onto walls and ceilings to swing across stuff, as well as items to pull them out of unreachable locations, and enemies to pull them closer or possibly disarm them even. The Chain Rod also strikes in multiple directions, which means Mega Man Zero 2 figured out multi-directional whip strikes and creative whip uses on the Game Boy Advance, while the Castlevania series decided GBA players would be much happier with a backdash. Yippee. That actually annoys me now that I think about it, so thank you for that, and kindly fuck off. The Chain Rod is a nice, useful tool at times, but it is not perfect. Only the green tip of the chain actually hits, so you can't use it the same way you would a whip. The rod doesn't latch onto anything unless you're airborne, and even then the collision detection is not quite exact. Swinging and trying to get momentum is a pain in the ass comparable to wall jumping in NES Strider, which the less said the better. Ultimately, it's a thing unique to Mega Man Zero 2, and while there are some segments that require its use, it is not something you're going to go back to every so often unless you're disarming shields from a drone or moving furniture around. Another change is that Zero 2 replaces the retry chip-esque continue system of the previous game with a proper life system. Basically, you die, you lose a life, respawn at a checkpoint if you passed one, lose all your lives, and it's game over. This is one of a number of changes for the better, by the way. So after some unskippable cutscenes play out, you get to your mission select screen, which is presented like a traditional Mega Man stage select. In fact, the missions themselves are just straightforward Mega Man X style levels, and no longer interconnected levels to a larger open world, which I'm sure made some people sad that another franchise eluded the search action bug, for lack of a better term. Honestly, I think it's a good call. It gives more variety to levels, and some of these levels are just fun to play. Riding the train, hopping along aircraft, which apparently executes better in a 2D side-scroller than the 3D pile of shit, as was the case with Mega Man X7, so major kudos on that count. Now with that said, the levels themselves are not entirely as straightforward as a traditional old-school Mega Man level. Some of these levels gives you additional objectives to accomplish: rescue some soldiers, destroy some equipment, defend the cargo, that sort of thing. Now these aren't requirements, you could skip these beats or fail to meet these goals and still complete the level like normal. You'll just score lower than if you were to complete your given objectives. Now once the bosses are killed off, you can revisit these stages and play through them normally, perhaps find some alternate route that contains some extra goodies here and there, that sort of thing. Now grading once again returns, but plays a more pivotal role than in the previous game. If you enter a boss battle with an A ranking or an S ranking, you'll not only fight a harder boss battle, but defeating said harder boss battle with such a rank will net you that boss's EX skill that can be equipped, then executed with a special command or with the appropriate equipment. Defeating a boss with anything less than an A ranking gets you nothing unless that boss is holding one of the 3 elemental chips you can equip to your weapon slot. So on the one hand, there is an additional incentive to aiming for that A ranking because you'll get an additional ability as a reward for winning the tougher boss fight, and it also reintroduces some vintage Zero gameplay from the Mega Man X days of centuries past. On the other hand though, EX skills are a bonus bit and not a necessary component for completing the game, though they are fun to use and there are cyber elves that you could use to magically bump yourself to an A ranking, which makes life a little easier in attaining those EX skills if you should want those. Another new feature you can attain are forms, which basically paints Zero different colors and gives them unique abilities and stats. For example, one form will change a saber strike in your combo, another will focus on attack power at the cost of everything else, and so on and so forth. Forms require you accomplish a certain condition to attain, whether it be killing a number of enemies with a specific weapon or collecting a number of items or what have you. And this can only be done during an active mission, not when you're revisiting a level, and only one form can be earned at a time. Again, it's not much and not necessarily a vital component in the long run, but the fact that it's there gives you a little more something to shoot for. And of course we have the Cyber Elf system introduced in the previous game. Largely unchanged from before, you can find Cyber Elves in little containers scattered throughout the levels, or some enemies and mid-bosses will sometimes drop them. You can talk to Ciel to manage your collected Cyber Elves, feed them E-crystals to grow them, and download them so they can be used for a variety of things, either temporary effects like cover fire, health restoration, or bumping your ranking to an A, useful for attaining those EX skills, or more permanent effects such as health extensions and additional sub-tanks, which, by the way, the game also allows you to seek out sub-tanks on their own without sacrificing any elves. Because of course, once again, using Cyber Elves will have a negative effect on your ranking, so once again if you value your high ranking, this is something you want to stay away from, and once again I must stress, lame. Mega Man Zero 2 is where the series I feel starts to find its footing somewhat, keeping the things that worked on the previous game while ditching the stuff that didn't. There's no open world to explore, but there's more variety in the level design as well as the overall terrain, resulting in some pretty challenging but very enjoyable little segments. Defeating a boss with a high ranking will net you a new special attack, and the different forms you can earn has its high and lows but are an interesting new reward regardless. Now mind you, there's some aspects that stuck around that still don't quite work. The grind to build up your weapons proficiency is still a bit of a drag. Being penalized for using Cyber Elves is still somewhat of a sour point, especially if this is a feature you've been pushing as a unique thing for this franchise, and yet you get punished for using it. That doesn't quite sit too well with me. And once again, you've got a game being driven by a somewhat flimsy narrative with an antagonist you could probably see coming a mile away, but I don't mind that because the rest of the game is actually quite nice. As per tradition, the visuals of Mega Man Zero 2 largely resemble those of its predecessor. Same sprite work, same animation, similar design style. They cleaned up the mugshots somewhat, but that's about it. You've got some new enemy and boss designs that are pretty much in line with what came before, but the highlight is level design. No longer tied to a dull, dilapidated city setting with a token desert attached to it, or whatever the case may be. You now have a variety of terrain to explore, and it's much more colorful and vibrant compared to the dreary settings of the previous game. Like I said, this is one of many changes for the better. On occasions, there will be cutscenes that will play out, and sometimes they'll have these illustrations pop up instead of the usual talking sprite bits, and these are nice to spruce things up here and there, but that's about it. Sound has also seen a bit of an improvement. The game does use the same sound effects as the previous game, and those are of the same quality as before. Some good sounds, some not so good sounds, almost all of them with this faint echo effect. Same for the brief vocal bits, of which there are more of them this time around, I think. The musical aspect has seen something of an improvement, as Zero 2 has some pretty high-octane, head-banging tunes to complement some of the game's more intense levels. Needless to say, there's some pretty good stuff here all around, but once again my issue stems from the instrumentation used to compose these tracks, as some of these songs have a grating, almost scraping twang to some of its high notes. The intro theme Departure has one particular high note that really hurts my ears every time I hear it, and it's been like this for years, so yeah, other than that, it's a step up if nothing else. Well, that's more like it. Mega Man Zero 2 took what worked with the previous game, jettisoned most of what didn't, and added its own bells and whistles to create a satisfying game that in hindsight I kinda wish I'd played first instead of that first game. But regardless, Mega Man Zero 2 is a solid action game with some varied level designs and scenarios, some fun boss battles, and there's an incentive to aim for that A ranking in the form of the new EX moves, and even going for the various forms gives this sequel a little more substance than its predecessor. All in all, a damn fine game that's fun and challenging to play. Now I'm actually looking forward to the next one. We'll see if we get to that soon enough, I guess.